Okay, so I thought it was about time for a film review. Now, with my film reviews, I don't just cover newly released films, but also older films. And the film I'm about to cover is already 23 years old. Gettysburg. Gettysburg, released in October 1993. Now, I believe this is one of the most underrated war films ever made. Indeed, underrated films ever made. I think it is a very, very powerful war film, and that's part of the reason I want to do this review because I believe it is hugely underappreciated. It never comes in the list of the top films ever made. It never comes even in the list of greatest war films ever made, which I believe is a travesty, because I believe this is a very, very moving film. Now, it's based on this novel. Got this on eBay. The Killer Angels by Michael Shaara, published in 1974. Pulitzer Prize winning novel. This just a little bit of background. Well, actually, I'll go into that just there. Some of the basic details about the film. So it was produced by Moctezuma Esparza and Robert Katz. The director was Robert F. Maxwell, and initially the film was going to be a series on PBS. But after another series on Custer, which had been seen to be a commercial failure, it was then decided that what actually happened was Ted Turner, the media mogul who set up CNN, of course, came in and saved the project, and was then produced by Turner Pictures, and the distributing studio was New Line Cinema. So Gettysburg is an epic. It's 4 hours, 14 minutes in length, which is one of the longest films ever produced by a Hollywood studio. And in most productions, most DVD video versions, it's in two parts. Has a big cast, as you can imagine. Covers some of the major generals and officers of the involved in the battle. Um, and it is interesting that the film heavily used reenactors. Some of these people are well-known actors, but there was also heavy use of reenactors because within the battle scenes there were a lot of extras. So just quickly read out the main cast. So Tom Berenger played Lieutenant General James Longstreet. Jeff Daniels played Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Martin Sheen played General Robert E. Lee. Kevin Conway played Sergeant Buster Culrain. I'm going to speak a bit more about some of these characters in a minute. C. Thomas Howell played Lieutenant Thomas Chamberlain. Richard Jordan in his last film played Brigadier General Louis Armistead. Richard Anderson played Major General George Meade. Royce D. Applegate played Brigadier General James L. Kemper. I just found out something about Royce D. Applegate. Yes, apparently died in a house fire a few years ago, so that was something that really shocked me. John Deal played Private Joseph Buckland. Maxwell Caulfield played Colonel Strong Vincent. Joshua D. Moore played Colonel James Clay Rice. Patrick Gorman, Major General John Bell Hood. Cooper Huckabee, Henry Thomas Harrison, who has an important role actually in the introduction of the film. He's a Confederate spy, who had been an actor, and there's a line by Robert E. Lee's character, "We move on the word of an actor." He's sort of questioning that. James Lancaster played Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards. He's an interesting character. I'm going to speak more about him. Brian Mallon, Major General Winfield Scott Hancock. I actually have an autograph by Brian Mallon. I'm going to get more into that in a minute. Andrew Prine, Brigadier General Richard B. Garnett. John Rothman, Major General John F. Reynolds. Tim Scott as Lieutenant General Richard E. Ewell. Morgan Shepherd as Major General Isaac R. Trimble. Stephen Lang as Major General George Pickett. Sam Elliott as Brigadier General John Buford. And getting to the end of the list now, I just want to read these out. Some of them have bigger roles than others. Bo Brinkman as Major General Walter H. Taylor. Kieran Mulrooney as Major Moxley Sorrell. James Patrick Stewart as Colonel Edward Porter Alexander. He was in charge of the Confederate artillery barrage before Pickett's charge. only 28 years old on the day of the battle. Warren Burton, Major General Henry Heath, Buck Taylor, Colonel William Gamble, David Carpenter, Colonel Thomas C. Devon, Donald Lowe, Captain Ellis Spear, Herb Mitchell, Sergeant Andrew J. Tozier, Dwyer Brown, Captain Brewer, and George Lazenby as General J. Johnston Pettigrew. George Lazenby, of course, of James Bond fame. Okay, so that's a big lineup in the cast. One noticeable thing about this film has very, very, very few women in the film. I think the only scene is when there are Union troops marching through Taneytown, which is a hamlet near Gettysburg, and they sort of cheer the troops on, but it's about 5 seconds. That's in contrast to the prequel film Gods and Generals, released in 2003. Gods and Generals itself is an impressive film, and there should be a third film in the trilogy. Incidentally, Jeff Shaara, who is um, who is Michael Shaara's son, wrote the book for Gods and Generals. Now, I have a big personal interest in the American Civil War. My family actually stayed at Gettysburg in 1999. If you don't know, Gettysburg is a small town in Pennsylvania and was the scene of a very, very decisive battle during the American Civil War. It's also the scene of Abraham Lincoln's famous Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address. So Gettysburg it's a small place, only has about 14,000 people thereabouts, but it's a town that really is steeped in history. I've been in two famous battlefields in my lifetime, the Somme in northern France and Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and both sites have a real atmosphere, as you can imagine. Now, in recent years, I discovered that, and having watched this film many times, it is briefly mentioned in the film and in the book. I had a relative who was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, distant relative, Charles E. Hazlett of Zanesville, Ohio. He was in the United States Army, um, and he was killed on Little Round Top shortly before Chamberlain took over the command there. Um, Now, regarding this film, it is a film that is very much for Civil War buffs, so you could say it's almost a cult film in that sense, and that could be one reason why it doesn't have wider recognition. At the time, it was commercially successful insofar as it um, it turned over a success in the box office. The budget was 15 million. It made about 44 million. But I think it's a great pity that it is not a better known film. Um, the score um, of the film, unfortunately, I've forgotten who produced the score, but it is again a very, very moving soundtrack, and in my opinion, some of the most moving battle scenes in film history. Now, the film is divided into two parts, but it's focusing on the 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg. The first day focuses on General Buford's sort of laying of the ground, played by Sam Elliott. The second day focuses on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's defence of Little Round Top. Many cited Chamberlain for possibly saving the Union Army. That day he took over command after Colonel Strong Vincent, was killed. Um, and there's a very brief reference in that line in the film. Hazlett's been wounded, or Hazlett's down. So Hazlett's battery, that's the Hazlett who I'm distantly related to. And then the third day focuses on Pickett's charge. Now, that scene especially is, in my opinion, one of the most moving scenes in film history. Critics generally praised the film, but there was one critic, I forget his name, and he alleged that it was Southern propaganda. Now, I could not disagree more. One of the real strengths of this film is that you honestly cannot accuse it of bias either way. The film really, really does look at the perspectives of both sides. They focus on key figures on both sides. And one thing I would say about the Battle of Gettysburg and about the Civil War really in general is that there is, of course, a moral question about the Civil War being over slavery and so on, but there is a lot said about, sometimes I get a little bit annoyed by some of the statements online, like, what's the big deal about Pickett's charge? They were dying to defend slavery. What people need to understand is the average Confederate soldier did not own slaves, they were dirt poor. Now, I've studied the Civil War closely, and believe me, I would have been on the Union side morally, and my whole life I've been a Unionist. Morally, believe the Union was right in the American Civil War. I'm a British Unionist. I staunchly support our Union, but the thing about the Battle of Gettysburg, and especially Pickett's charge, it was called the high water mark of the Confederacy. Put it this way, on the 50th anniversary, on the 75th anniversary as well, in 1938, there was an overwhelming sense of emotion as there was a reunion on the battlefield, and the men who were there that day, that I mean, this is true of every war and every battle, but the courage that they would have shown on an individual basis was truly astonishing. I mean, the 13,000 Confederates who faced the Union barrage at Pickett's Charge, or the men of the 20th Maine who ran down Little Round Top, and the courage is just, that sort of Victorian style warfare was really quite something. Um, and I really, really think this film Gettysburg encapsulates all of that. And I think for an event as pivotal as Gettysburg, I mean, put it this way, if it had been entirely from a Union point of view, there would be people in the South saying, oh, this is Union bias. I think when you're covering a film about the Civil War, you have to look at both sides. You simply have to. It's the very nature of Civil War. And of course, you could look at the slavery question, you could look at the moral issues, but at the end of the day, a poor farm boy from Alabama did not own slaves. And I defy anyone to watch this film and not feel moved afterwards. It's a very, very powerful film. Ken Burns, incidentally, makes a cameo towards the end. Um, During the last day's battle, he is sort of aide de camp who says to General Hancock, please, sir, we cannot spare you. And General Hancock turns around and says, there are times when a corps commander's life does not count. Chamberlain and his brother are sort of looking on in inspiration. That's a cameo by Ken Burns. Now, Ken Burns is known for making the PBS, award-winning PBS documentary, The Civil War, which is, it's a marathon of a documentary, something like 8 hours long. Brian Mallon, like I say, I've got his autograph. I went to a reenactment when we stayed in Gettysburg. But I just think this is such a powerful film, and if you're interested in the American Civil War, do check this out. Now, in terms of accuracy, I haven't seen any major controversies about the film. I'm sure there will, people will nitpick and they'll find something here or there that is inaccurate. I will say one thing. There's a character, Colonel Arthur Fremantle, now in the film. He is introduced as an English officer, and as he's introduced to General Longstreet, or actually Longstreet himself says, you might say he is the eyes and ears of Queen Victoria, and Fremantle sort of waves that off and says, hardly, sir, I'm just observer. In the film, they show him in his red tunic, very much the British redcoats, so to speak. Um, this is somewhat inaccurate. In actual history, he would have been wearing a grey deerskin suit. The United Kingdom, of course, had a very important role in the American Civil War. We were officially neutral, but both sides really pushed hard to get us involved. Palmerston had a key role in the American Civil War, so did Prince Albert. At one point, the American Civil War even landed on our doorstep when there was a skirmish at Liverpool Bay. There was also several major incidents, for example, involving Confederate uh, prisoners on neutral ships and so on and so on. We were in a difficult position because, on one hand, the United Kingdom was morally opposed to the institution of slavery. So morally, they were on the side of the Union. Queen Victoria supposedly wept as she read Uncle Tom's Cabin. But economically, we had close ties to the South because the cotton manufacturing in Lancashire, in northern England, in the mills of Manchester and Leeds, directly relied on the southern cotton industry. So there was one point in the Civil War, I believe in 1862, when the South deliberately let cotton bales just rot away in order to put pressure on the government of Lord Palmerston to bring Britain into the war. It never happened. but there were a few points when we very, very nearly came in militarily. Canada and Mexico, of course, were closely involved as well. Um, but anyway, Arthur Fremantle's an interesting character. He's played by James Lancaster, and he's very much seen to be a bit of the stereotype of the pith helmets, sort of British Empire, la di da, tea drinking, tough. And from this side of the Atlantic, when British viewers watch the film, it's almost comical. I like the character, and I think yeah, I actually like the role he plays in the film, even if it is inaccurate. I think it brings a certain eccentricity. Humor would maybe be the wrong word because obviously this is not a film that's intended for humor. It's a very serious, dramatic, historical film. But um, my father and I, as we watch the film, always find it amusing as Fremantle's wandering around the battlefield with a cup of tea in his hand. So I really do put in the British stereotypes with that. Jeff Daniels does a great role as Chamberlain, and another feature I like of this film with the introduction. Incidentally, Morgan Shepherd does the voiceover for that, and Morgan Shepherd plays General Trimble, who was one of the subordinates of General Pickett during Pickett's charge. Um, he does the voiceover for that. Well, during the introduction, they show the photographs of the real world characters, and the actors who are playing them in it is astonishing. Thomas Chamberlain, for example, played by C. Thomas Howell, it's uncanny. The moustache just morphs into the actor, the photograph of the real man. One character who is interesting in both the film and novel is Buster Coleraine. Again, this is a bit of an anachronism because Buster wasn't a name that was popularised until the 20th century. In the book Gods and Generals, he is described as being born in Belfast in 1812 and being an Irish immigrant, as much as the Union Army was. And in the story, he was demoted for bad behaviour from a sergeant to a private, and then because of his courage at Little Round Top, Chamberlain promoted him again. Now, in the film, he's played by Kevin Conway, and Chamberlain and his brother sort of look him up. He's almost like a father figure to them. Um, he's one of the memorable characters. He's one of the very few characters, though, who was not a real person, but he may be a composite of real people, possibly one Sergeant George Buck. So I find it fascinating to do the research of some of these characters, and it's a film in a sense I've grown up with, and it's one of the films I've watched most. I never tire of it. In fact, I'm playing it in mute right now. Yeah, maybe the screen isn't too clean, but too clear. And I'm going to round this up. This has been quite a long review, but like I say, it is a long film. Um, I could not disagree more with the critic who said that it's biased towards the Confederacy. It is true that in the second half of the film, it's focusing on Pickett's charge and focusing on the Confederate side. But the thing is, take for example Gone with the Wind, which is an epic film and it has some strong moments. The problem with Gone with the Wind, it really was Southern propaganda. I mean, it presented the South in a very romanticized light. Um, there are other films that are much more from the northern perspective, like Gangs of New York, which is also one of my favorite films, and I'll do a review about that another time. But Gettysburg really is neutral, and I don't think you can have it any other way with such a pivotal battle in American history. Um, Incidentally, Gods and Generals is also pretty neutral. Gods and Generals, I may as well amalgamate the review in that there's a few switchovers. So, for example, Stephen Lang, who plays Pickett in Gettysburg, plays General Stonewall Jackson in Gods and Generals. Anyway, I'm going to round this up because I've spoken in this at length, and most of my film reviews are considerably shorter than this. If you are interested in the American Civil War, do check out this film. It is long, but break it into two parts. It is really, really worth watching. In my opinion, it is one of the greatest films, yeah, ever made. I also think it's one of the greatest war films. Some people may kind of stick their nose up at the fact that not all the actors are big actors. You have big actors playing the main roles, but really, I really think it encapsulates the poignancy of that battle in the American psyche, and I think think it's just a very, very impressive film. Um, I'm really hard pushed to fault it. I'm sure there are inaccuracies therein. I'm sure there are things that can be pointed out, but I just find it to be epic from the introduction to the battle scenes, the score. I'll try and put an annotation to who composed the score because he definitely deserves a mention. But that's my review of Gettysburg, 1993.